The orders arrived at dawn, stamped with the heavy red seal of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. Private Alexei Petrov barely had time to finish his cigarette before Sergeant Volkov barked his name across the barracks. "Petrov, pack your gear. You're reassigned." Alexei crushed the cigarette under his boot, the embers fading into the cracked concrete. "Where to, Comrade Sergeant?" Volkov's face was unreadable beneath the shadow of his cap. "Pripyat. Cleanup detail." A murmur rippled through the barracks. Pripyat. The name alone carried weight. The city had been evacuated months ago, sealed off after the disaster at Reactor 4. No one spoke of it openly, but the rumors slithered through the ranks like radiation through soil. The briefing was held in a dimly lit office, the air thick with the scent of stale tobacco and damp paper. A lieutenant with hollow eyes slid a file across the desk. "Your unit will assist in securing the perimeter," he said, voice flat. "Radiation levels are elevated but controlled. Follow protocol, and you'll be fine." Alexei scanned the documents, sterile reports, sanitized maps, blacked out paragraphs. The lieutenant's fingers tapped the desk, nails yellowed. "There have been disturbances," he added, as if reading Alexei's thoughts. "Animals, mostly. Strays acting erratic. Ignore them." A Geiger counter on the shelf clicked softly, rhythmically. The lieutenant didn't flinch. Outside, the transport trucks idled, their exhaust mingling with the morning mist. Alexei's squadmates joked nervously, their laughter brittle. Only Corporal Lebedev was silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky met the dead zone. "You ever hear the stories?" Lebedev muttered as they boarded the truck. Alexei adjusted his gas mask strap. "What stories?" Lebedev's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The ones about the church." The engine roared to life, drowning out his next words. But as the convoy rolled toward Pripyat, Alexei could have sworn he heard something else beneath the diesel growl. A whisper, a giggle, slipping through the static of the radio. The Geiger counter in his pocket clicked faster. No one else seemed to notice. The truck shuddered to a halt, its engine sputtering into silence. Alexei stepped onto cracked asphalt, his boots kicking up dust that hung in the air like a ghost of the city itself. Pripyat stretched before him. Empty windows stared like hollow eyes, and the skeletal remains of playgrounds swayed in the wind. "Welcome to paradise," Corporal Lebedev muttered beside him, adjusting the strap of his gas mask. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the distant hum of the reactor and the steady, insistent clicking of Alexei's Geiger counter. The needle trembled in the high range, but not enough to trigger alarms. Not yet. "Mend!" Sergeant Volkov barked orders, his voice muffled by his mask. "Perimeter sweep. Stay in pairs. Report anything unusual, movement, debris, anything." Alexei exchanged a glance with Lebedev. Unusual was relative here. The streets were littered with abandoned possessions, a child's shoe, a rusted bicycle, a doll with its face half melted by heat. The air smelled of ozone and something metallic, like old blood. They moved in formation, rifles slung but ready. The buildings loomed, their walls streaked with dark, vein like cracks. Alexei's breath fogged his mask. Then laughter. High-pitched, playful, echoing from an alleyway. Alexei froze. "You hear that?" Lebedev's grip tightened on his rifle. "Hear what?" The laughter came again, closer now. A child's giggle, bright and wrong in the stillness. "Radio static," Lebedev said too quickly. "Interference from the plant." Alexei's Geiger counter stuttered, the clicks erratic. He turned toward the sound, just in time to see a pale flicker between the buildings. A small figure, gone before he could blink. "Did you?" "Nothing's there." Sergeant Volkov barked orders, his voice muffled by his mask. Perimeter sweep. Stay in pairs. Report anything unusual, movement, debris, anything. Alexei exchanged a glance with Lebedev. Unusual was relative here. The streets were littered with abandoned possessions, a child's shoe, a rusted bicycle, a doll with its face half melted by heat. The air smelled of ozone and something metallic, like old blood. They moved in formation, rifles slung but ready. The buildings loomed, their walls streaked with dark, vein like cracks. Alexei's breath fogged his mask. Then laughter. High-pitched, playful, echoing from an alleyway. Alexei froze. You hear that? Lebedev's grip tightened on his rifle. Hear what? The laughter came again, closer now. A child's giggle, bright and wrong in the stillness. Radio static, Lebedev said too quickly. Interference from the plant. Alexei's Geiger counter stuttered, the clicks erratic. He turned toward the sound, just in time to see a pale flicker between the buildings. A small figure, gone before he could blink. Did you? Nothing's there, Lebedev snapped. Keep moving. They reached the town square. At its center stood the church, its onion domes blackened, its doors sagging open like a wound. The Orthodox crosses had been twisted, the icons inside shattered. A cold draft seeped from the entrance, carrying the scent of damp earth and something sweetly rotten. Volkov's voice crackled over the radio. Team 2, report. Lebedev keyed the mic. No contacts. Proceeding to, static hissed back. Then, beneath the noise, a whisper, don't let them see you. Alexei's blood turned to ice. You heard that, right? Lebedev yanked the radio from his belt and shook it, faulty wiring. This place is crawling with interference. But the whispers didn't stop. They slithered through the static, voices overlapping, children's voices, singing a nursery rhyme Alexei half remembered from his own childhood. The church will wake. The walls will shake. A shadow moved in the doorway. Alexei raised his rifle. Someone's inside. Lebedev grabbed his arm. We're not cleared to engage. Orders are to observe, and a giggle right behind them. They spun. The square was empty. Then the radio screamed. It was a sound like metal tearing, like 100 voices shrieking at once. Alexei ripped the device from his belt and hurled it to the ground. The plastic cracked, but the noise didn't stop. It rose, higher and higher, until the church's windows shattered in unison. Silence. Alexei's ears rang. His Geiger counter was a frantic machine gun rattle now, the needle buried in the red. Volkov's voice, when it came, was eerily calm. Team 2 returned to base. Now, they ran. Behind them, the church doors groaned shut. The base was little more than a hastily converted schoolhouse, its walls lined with peeling propaganda posters and radiation warning signs. Alexei sat on his cot, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision, trying to ignore the way his hands trembled. The others joked about jumpy rookies and overactive imaginations, but their laughter was too loud, too forced. Only Lebedev was silent, staring at the radio as if it might whisper again. Sergeant Volkov entered, his face unreadable beneath the harsh fluorescent light. Patrol routes are set. 2-man teams, standard sweep. Keep comms open and stick to the route. His gaze lingered on Alexei. No detours. Alexei nodded, but the memory of the church's blackened doors pressed against his thoughts. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of rust and damp concrete. The Geiger counters clicked in unison, a morbid metronome. Alexei was paired with Private Markov, a wiry conscript from Minsk who chewed gum like it was his last ration. Ever seen a ghost, Petrov? Markov asked, grinning behind his mask. Alexei adjusted his rifle strap. No such thing. Markov snorted. Tell that to the guys who swear they've seen shadows moving in the hospital. He kicked a crumpled soda can, the sound echoing down the empty street. Whole city's a graveyard. Who's to say the dead don't walk here? The wind picked up, carrying a whisper, wrong place, wrong time, before fading into static. Alexei's Geiger counter stuttered. Radio check, he said, tapping his earpiece. Markov's voice crackled back, loud and clear. But seriously, you ever hear about the... A giggle cut through the transmission. Alexei froze. You hear that? Markov's grin faltered. Hear what? The laughter came again, high and bright, from the alley to their left. A child's voice, singing a nursery rhyme. The church will wake, the walls will shake. Alexei swung his rifle toward the sound. The alley was empty, save for a broken doll slumped against the wall, its glass eyes reflecting the pale glow of the streetlight. Markov exhaled sharply. Wind, or a stray cat. The doll's head tilted forward with a soft click. Alexei's finger hovered over the trigger. Then the radio hissed to life. Volkov's voice, tight with static, Team 3, report your position. Markov keyed the mic. Approaching the hospital, no Kant, a shadow darted across the road. Alexei spun, his breath fogging the mask. Did you see that? Markov's grip on his rifle was white-knuckled. See what? The Geiger counter screamed. The streetlights flickered. And from the hospital's shattered windows, a dozen pale faces peered down at them, smiling. Markov stumbled back. The radio erupted in a chorus of shrieks, the voices of children and soldiers tangled together. Alexei grabbed Markov's arm and ran, their boots pounding against the cracked pavement. Behind them, the laughter followed, bouncing off the walls like a living thing. Volkov's voice cut through the noise, sharp as a blade. All teams, fall back, now. They didn't stop running until the base's floodlights burned the shadows away. But in the silence that followed, Alexei could still hear it, the whisper of small feet just beyond the wire, waiting. The mess hall was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and sweat. Soldiers hunched over their trays, their laughter too loud, their eyes darting to the windows as if expecting something to press against the glass. Alexei stirred his lukewarm soup, the spoon clinking against the tin bowl like a Geiger counter's warning. Private Sokolov, a burly man from the Urals with a fading black eye, slammed his fist on the table. I'm telling you, I saw it. Pale as milk, just standing there in the window of that apartment block, watching us. Markov rolled his eyes. Radiation sickness. Makes you see shit. Remember the briefing? Sokolov's jaw tightened. I know what I saw. Alexei glanced at Lebedev, who sat apart from the others, methodically disassembling his rifle. His fingers moved with practiced precision, but his gaze kept flicking to the door. Sergeant Volkov entered, his boots scraping against the linoleum. The room fell silent. Debrief in 5. And no more ghost stories. His glare lingered on Sokolov. We're soldiers, not superstitious old women. But as Volkov turned away, Alexei caught the way his hand twitched toward the pistol at his hip, like he expected something to grab him from the shadows. The patrol that night was different. No jokes, no chatter. Just the crunch of boots on broken glass and the ever-present click of Geiger counters. Alexei was paired with Sokolov this time, the man's broad shoulders tense beneath his uniform. You ever hear about the experiments? Sokolov muttered, his voice low. Alexei kept his rifle ready. What experiments? Sokolov hesitated, then leaned closer. Before the meltdown. They say the KGB was testing something in Pripyat, kids, orphans, something to do with radiation tolerance. He glanced at the ruins around them. Guess we know how that turned out. A gust of wind hissed through the skeletal trees, carrying the scent of something burnt and sweet. Alexei's Geiger counter stuttered. Alexei said, but his throat was dry. Sokolov grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then why's your hand shaking? A sound cut through the night, a whisper, too crisp to be the wind. I have found you. Alexei spun, rifle raised. The street was empty. Sokolov exhaled sharply. See? Nothing. But his knuckles were white around his weapon. Then, movement. A flicker of white in a third-floor window of a crumbling apartment block. A face, pale and smooth, peering down at them. No eyes, just dark hollows. Alexei's breath caught. Sokolov. The face vanished. Sokolov hadn't turned. What? Window. Third floor. Sokolov squinted. Broken glass. Reflections. The radio crackled. Volkov's voice. Team 4, report. Sokolov keyed the mic. All clear. Proceeding to a giggle, not from the radio. From above. Alexei looked up. The figure was in the window again, closer now. Its mouth stretched into a grin too wide for its face. Then the glass shattered. Not from gunfire. Not from wind, as if something had pushed it out from the inside. Sokolov cursed, stumbling back. The Geiger counter screamed. Alexei grabbed Sokolov's arm. Run. They didn't stop until they hit the checkpoint, their lungs burning. The guard at the gate frowned. What's wrong with you two? Sokolov doubled over, gasping. Nothing, just a dog. Alexei said nothing. But as they walked back to the barracks, he felt it, the weight of eyes on his back. And from the ruins, a whisper. Come play. The locals avoided the soldiers like the plague. They spoke in hushed tones, crossing themselves whenever the patrols passed by. But one evening, as Alexei stood guard near the checkpoint, an old woman shuffled forward, her shawl pulled tight against the creeping dusk. You, she rasped, her voice like dry leaves. You go to the church? Alexei tightened his grip on his rifle. What church? Her milky eyes darted toward the skeletal outline of the onion domes in the distance. That one. The old one with the black doors. She leaned in, her breath sour with fear. Don't. The children there, they don't like strangers. Alexei's Geiger counter clicked faster. What children? The woman made the sign of the cross again, her fingers trembling. The ones who never left. Then she turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving only the echo of her warning. The next morning, Sergeant Volkov gathered the squad in the briefing room. A map of Pripyat was spread across the table, a red circle drawn around the church. Command wants it searched, Volkov said, his voice flat. Reports of looters. Markov scoffed. Looters? In that place? Volkov's glare silenced him. Orders are orders. Team 2, Petrov. Lebedev, you're on point. Alexei's stomach twisted. Lebedev, standing beside him, went very still. The squad moved out at noon, the sun a pale smear behind the clouds. The streets were quieter than usual, the silence thick enough to choke on. Even Markov didn't joke this time. As they approached the church, the air grew colder. The blackened doors stood slightly ajar, the wood warped as if something had forced its way out or in. The crosses above the entrance were twisted, the icons shattered. Volkov signaled for silence. Petrov, Lebedev, inside. Rest of us hold perimeter. Alexei exchanged a glance with Lebedev. The corporal's face was grim, but he nodded. They stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and something metallic, like old blood. The pews were overturned, the altar stripped bare. But the walls. Alexei's breath caught. The walls were moving. Not the stone, the shadows. They slithered like ink, pooling into shapes, small, hunched figures, their outlines flickering in the dim light. Lebedev grabbed his arm. "Don't look." A whisper from the rafters. "You're late." Alexei's Geiger counter erupted into a frenzied rattle. He swung his rifle toward the sound, just as a pale hand darted from the shadows and brushed against his sleeve. Cold. So cold it burned. Lebedev yanked him back. "Move." They stumbled into the sunlight, the church doors slamming shut behind them with a force that shook the ground. Volkov's face was ashen. "Report." Lebedev's voice was steady, but his hands shook, empty. "Just rats." Alexei opened his mouth, then froze. Through the broken stained glass, a dozen small faces pressed against the windows, their smiles too wide, their eyes black as the vines crawling up the walls. Volkov didn't look. "Fall back to base." As they retreated, the whispers followed, threading through the static of the radios. "Come back soon." And beneath it, barely audible, the sound of children laughing. The fog rolled in like a living thing, swallowing the skeletal remains of Pripyat whole. One moment, the church's blackened steeple was visible against the ashen sky. The next, it vanished behind a wall of shifting gray. Alexei tightened his grip on his rifle, his breath fogging the inside of his gas mask. The air tasted of ozone and decay, metallic and sweet in a way that made his teeth ache. Beside him, Lebedev adjusted the strap of his Geiger counter, its rhythmic clicks now stuttering like a dying heartbeat. "Radiation spiking," he muttered. "Not just background noise anymore." Alexei didn't answer. His own counter was a frantic percussion against his hip, the needle buried deep in the red. Volkov's voice crackled over the radio, distorted by static. "Team 2, confirm position." Lebedev keyed the mic, 200 meters west of the church. "Fog's too thick." A giggle cut through the transmission, high-pitched, playful. Alexei's head snapped up. "You heard that?" Lebedev's jaw clenched. "Interference." The radio hissed. Then a child's voice whispered, "You're getting closer." Lebedev ripped the device from his belt and stared at it, his knuckles white. The display screen flickered. No signal, yet the whispers continued, threading through the static like fingers through hair. Alexei's skin prickled. "We should turn back." Lebedev shook his head. Orders are orders. But his eyes darted to the fog, where shadows moved just beyond visibility. They advanced, boots sinking into the damp earth. The ground here was uneven, tangled with blackened roots that pulsed faintly, as if breathing. Alexei's light caught something glistening on the bark, thick, dark fluid, seeping from splits in the wood. "Lebedev," Alexei whispered, pointing. Lebedev's breath hitched. "Don't touch it." A gust of wind tore through the fog, revealing the church's silhouette for a fleeting second. Closer now, its doors gaping open like a maw. The crosses above the entrance were bent at unnatural angles, the icons defaced with jagged slashes. Then the fog swallowed it again. Alexei's Geiger counter shrieked. A figure darted past them, small, pale, gone before Alexei could raise his rifle. Lebedev spun, his weapon sweeping the mist. Movement. 3 o'clock. Alexei saw nothing, only the fog, shifting like something was moving through it, displacing the air without being seen. The radio crackled. "Den." Volkov's voice, but wrong, stretched thin, syllables slurring. It turned back, then laughter. Dozens of voices, overlapping, singing in a language that wasn't quite Russian. "The steeple wakes, the dead will shake." Alexei's blood turned to ice. "We need to go. Now." Lebedev didn't argue. They turned, retracing their steps, but the fog had thickened, the path behind them swallowed by the gray. The ground squelched underfoot, the roots writhing as if alive. A whisper, right beside Alexei's ear, "Stay." He fired. He fired. The shot echoed, deafening in the silence. The fog rippled, and for a heartbeat, Alexei saw them, small figures, their skin translucent, their eyes black pits. Dozens, hundreds, clustered between the trees, their mouths stretched in grins too wide for their faces. Then the fog closed in again. Lebedev grabbed his arm, dragging him forward. "Run." They sprinted, boots slipping on the slick earth. The church's steeple loomed behind them, its shadow stretching impossibly long, reaching for their heels. The Geiger counters were a continuous scream now, the radiation so thick it choked the air. Ahead, the perimeter lights flickered, safety just meters away. Then the ground gave way. Alexei fell, crashing into a tangle of roots that coiled around his legs like serpents. Cold seeped through his uniform, burning where it touched skin. Above him, the fog parted, and the faces peered down, children, their features melting like wax. Lebedev's hand closed around his wrist, hauling him free. They stumbled the last few steps, collapsing past the checkpoint as the guards shouted, rifles raised at the fog. But there was nothing to shoot. The mist receded as suddenly as it had come, leaving only the distant outline of the church, its doors now firmly shut. Volkov stood over them, his face unreadable. Report. Lebedev's voice was hollow. No contacts. Just fog. Alexei said nothing. But as they were dragged back to base, he felt it, the cold imprint of small fingers, lingering on his sleeve. And in his ear, a whisper only he could hear. "We'll see you soon." The church doors groaned as they pushed them open, the sound like a dying man's breath. Dust swirled in the fractured light from the shattered stained glass, catching on the edges of overturned pews and the splintered remains of the altar. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, sweet decay, like rotting fruit left too long in the sun. Alexei's Geiger counter clicked erratically, the needle twitching as if unsure of the threat. Lebedev moved beside him, his rifle sweeping the shadows. "Clear," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The floor was littered with debris, broken icons, torn hymnals, the skeletal remains of candles long since burned out. But it was the walls that held Alexei's attention. The faded frescoes of saints had been defaced, their eyes gouged out, their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles by crude knife marks. A whisper skittered across the stone. Alexei froze. "You hear that?" Lebedev didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the far corner of the nave, where the darkness seemed to coil and shift on its own. Then, laughter. High-pitched, playful, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. A child's giggle, bright and wrong in the hollow silence of the church. Alexei's finger hovered over his rifle's trigger. Where is that coming from? Lebedev's jaw tightened. Nowhere. It's the wind. But there was no wind. The air was dead, stagnant. The laughter came again, closer this time, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling like a living thing. Beneath it, something else, a wet, rhythmic sound, like fingers dragging along stone. Alexei's light flickered as he swung it toward the source. The beam cut through the dust, illuminating the base of the pulpit. There, curled in the shadows, was a figure, small, pale. Its back was to them, shoulders hunched as if crying. Dark hair hung in matted strands, and its fingers, too long, too thin, clawed at the floor, leaving streaks of something black and glistening. Alexei's breath caught. "Don't move." The figure went still. Then, slowly, its head began to turn. Lebedev's rifle snapped up. "Identify yourself." The laughter erupted again, but now it wasn't playful. It was mocking, A chorus of voices overlapping, rising in pitch until it bordered on screams. The figure's head kept turning, twisting past the point of human limitation, until its face. Alexei stumbled back. No eyes. Just hollow pits. A mouth stretched too wide, filled with needle-thin teeth. The Geiger counter screamed. The figure lunged. Alexei fired. The shot tore through the silence, the muzzle flash illuminating the nave for a single, horrifying second. The pews were full. Dozens of small figures, their heads snapping toward the sound, their grins identical. Then darkness swallowed them again. Lebedev grabbed Alexei's arm, dragging him toward the doors. Move. Move. The laughter followed, rising to a deafening crescendo as the church's walls trembled, dust raining from the ceiling. The doors slammed shut ahead of them, the wood groaning as something pressed against it from the outside. Alexei spun, his back to the doors, his rifle raised. The shadows moved. The figures stepped forward, their forms flickering like static, their voices a distorted chorus. You shouldn't have come back. Then the radio in Lebedev's belt burst to life, Volkov's voice barely audible beneath the shrieks. Fall back. The transmission cut off. The first of the children reached for them, and the world dissolved into noise. Flashlight beams cut through the gloom, trembling in Alexei's grip as he swept the light across the nave. Shadows coiled like living things, retreating from the light only to slither back the moment it passed. The laughter hadn't stopped. It echoed from the rafters, from the shattered confessional, from the hollows beneath the pews. Small, pale shapes darted just beyond the edges of vision, their movements too quick, too fluid. Lebedev's breath came in sharp bursts, his rifle trained on the darkness. They're everywhere. Alexei's Geiger counter stuttered wildly, its clicks merging into a single, unbroken scream. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something sweetly rotten, like spoiled milk left in a sealed room. His throat burned with every breath. A shadow flitted between the pews, small, hunched, its limbs too long for its body. Alexei jerked his light toward it. There. The beam caught the figure mid-motion, freezing it in place. A child, or something that had once been a child. Its skin was translucent, veins black beneath the surface like cracks in ice. It turned its head slowly, too slowly, and grinned. No teeth. Just a yawning black void. Lebedev fired. The shot tore through the figure's chest, but the thing didn't stagger, didn't bleed. It laughed, the sound wet and guttural, before dissolving into the shadows like smoke. Lebedev racked another round, his hands shaking. Did you see that? It didn't. A whisper right beside Alexei's ear. We don't bleed anymore. He spun, swinging the flashlight like a club. The beam illuminated the altar, and the figures perched atop it, their legs swinging like children on a bench. Dozens of them. Their eyes reflected the light like a cat's, glowing faintly before winking out. The radio on Lebedev's belt crackled. Volkov's voice, strained through static, Team 2 status, then a child's giggle, clear as day through the speaker. The transmission cut off. The figures on the altar tilted their heads in unison. Alexei's stomach dropped. We need to go, now. They backed toward the doors, rifles raised. The shadows pulsed, the laughter rising in pitch, in hunger. The floor trembled, not from footsteps, but from something deeper, something beneath the church. Then the first hand grabbed Lebedev. It shot from beneath a pew, skeletal fingers clamping around his ankle. He shouted, kicking free, but more hands emerged, dozens, hundreds, pale and grasping, dragging themselves from the cracks in the floor. Alexei fired into the mass, the muzzle flash illuminating the horror in strobes, faces pressing up through the floorboards, mouths open in silent screams. Black vines snaking from the walls, pulsing like veins. Lebedev, yanked off his feet, his scream cut short as the shadows swallowed him whole. Alexei ran. The doors were just meters away, but the church stretched, warped, the distance doubling with every step. The walls wept black fluid, the icons twisting in their frames, the saints' faces melting into something grotesque. A figure stepped into his path. Small, pale. Its head lolled to the side, neck broken, but it smiled anyway. "Stay with us," it whispered. Alexei slammed into it, knocking the thing aside, its body brittle as dried twigs. He hit the door's shoulder first, the wood groaning but not giving. Behind him, the laughter swelled, the shadows surging forward like a tide. He fired at the lock. The doors burst open, and he fell into the sunlight, the church's breath, cold and rotting, chasing him onto the steps. Silence. Alexei gasped, scrambling to his feet. The church stood as it had before, broken, desecrated, but still. No laughter, no figures, no Lebedev. Volkov's voice crackled over the radio, frantic. "Petrov, report." While Alexei stared at the church doors, now slightly ajar again, as if inviting him back inside. His Geiger counter had gone silent. He keyed the mic, his voice hollow. "Lebedev's gone." Static. Then, barely audible beneath the noise, a whisper. "Not gone. Just hiding." Alexei turned and ran, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his back. And from the steeple above, a chorus of giggles followed him all the way home. The church loomed behind him, its shadow stretching like grasping fingers across the cracked pavement. Alexei stood at the threshold, his breath ragged inside his gas mask, the taste of copper sharp on his tongue. The others were gone. Volkov had ordered a full retreat after Lebedev's disappearance, but Alexei had slipped away, drawn back to the church like a moth to a dying flame. "You shouldn't be here." The thought slithered through his mind, but his feet carried him forward anyway. The doors groaned as he pushed them open, the sound echoing through the hollow nave. Dust motes swirled in the fractured light, catching on the edges of the overturned altar. Something had changed. The pews were no longer scattered haphazardly. They had been dragged into a rough circle, their splintered legs pointing inward like the spokes of a wheel. At the center stood the altar, its wooden surface now exposed, stripped of its cloth, and carved into the wood were symbols. Alexei stepped closer, his boots crunching over shattered glass. The carvings were deep, deliberate, not Cyrillic, not any language he recognized. Jagged lines intersected with spirals, forming patterns that made his eyes ache if he stared too long. Some resembled stick figures, their limbs splayed in agony. Others looked like eyes, weeping black sap that pooled in the grooves. His Geiger counter stuttered to life, its clicks uneven, frantic. A whisper brushed against his ear. "You see it now." Alexei spun, rifle raised, but the church was empty. The only movement came from the dust, stirred by his own frantic breaths. He turned back to the altar. Beneath the symbols, nearly hidden by the shadows, was a name, scratched into the wood with something sharp. Mikhail. A child's name. The radio on his belt crackled, static hissing like a living thing. Then, beneath the noise, a voice, distorted, stretched thin. "Petrov, do you hear me?" Alexei fumbled for the radio. "Volkov." The static surged, swallowing the voice. Then, clear as day, a child's whisper. "He can't hear you." The altar shuddered. Alexei stumbled back as the wood split, a jagged fissure racing down its center. Black vines slithered from the crack, their surfaces glistening like wet ink. They pulsed, throbbing in time with the Geiger counter's erratic clicks. And from the darkness within the altar, something moved. A hand, small, pale, fingers too long, curled around the edge of the fissure. Then another. Then a face, pressing against the gap, its features blurred as if seen through frosted glass. No eyes. Just hollows. A mouth, stretching into a smile. "You found us," it whispered. The radio screamed, a sound like metal tearing, like 100 voices shrieking at once. Alexei dropped it, the plastic casing cracking against the stone floor. The vines surged forward, wrapping around his ankles, their touch burning cold. The figure in the altar tilted its head. "Stay." Alexei wrenched free, his boots slipping on the slick stone as he bolted for the doors. Behind him, the church trembled, the walls weeping black fluid, the symbols on the altar glowing faintly in the gloom. The doors slammed shut just as he reached them. He threw his weight against the wood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The vines snaked across the floor, curling around his legs, pulling him back. Then, with a final heave, the doors gave way. Alexei spilled into the sunlight, the church's breath, cold and rotting, chasing him onto the steps. He didn't stop running until the perimeter fence was in sight, his lungs burning, his Geiger counter A. Continuous scream. Volkov stood at the checkpoint, his face unreadable. "Where have you been?" Alexei opened his mouth, then froze. The radio in Volkov's hand was silent. No static. No voices. Just dead air. Alexei's voice was hoarse. Did you call for me?" Volkov's eyes narrowed. "No." A whisper from the ruins behind them. "Liar." Alexei turned, but the streets were empty. Only the church remained, its steeple black against the sky, its doors slightly ajar, waiting. The barracks were too quiet. No snoring, no rustling of cots, just the low hum of the generator outside and the occasional click of a Geiger counter. Alexei lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his fingers twitching toward the rifle propped against the wall. The others pretended to sleep, but he could see the whites of Markov's knuckles where he gripped his blanket, the way Sokolov's breath hitched every time the wind rattled the windows. Then the radio hissed to life. Static filled the room, sharp and sudden. Alexei sat up, his pulse hammering. No one had touched the device. It sat on the table, its display dark, yet the noise continued, rising in pitch until it scraped against his eardrums. Markov cursed, clapping his hands over his ears. "Turn it off." Sokolov lunged for the radio, but the moment his fingers brushed the plastic, the static changed. A voice, garbled, stretched thin, slithered through the noise. "Leave." Alexei's skin prickled. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a single voice. It was layers, overlapping, children and adults, and something older all tangled together. Sokolov recoiled, knocking the radio to the floor. The impact should have silenced it, but the voice only grew clearer. "Leave, or stay forever." The temperature dropped. Alexei's breath fogged in the air, the cold seeping into his bones. Outside, the generator sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Only the faint glow of the emergency exit sign remained, casting the soldiers in sickly red. Something moved in the corner. Alexei's head snapped toward the shadow between the bunks. A figure, small, hunched, stood there, its back to him. Pale hands pressed against the wall, fingers splayed like starfish. Markov saw it too. His lips formed a silent prayer, his body frozen. The figure's head tilted too far, too slow. Then the radio screamed. Not static. Not a voice. A sound like metal shearing, like 100 throats tearing open at once. The figure vanished, but the scream didn't stop. It echoed through the barracks, through Alexei's skull, vibrating in his teeth. Sokolov was the first to break. He bolted for the door, shoulder checking it open, and the others followed in a panicked stampede. Alexei barely had time to grab his rifle before Markov yanked him into the hall, their boots pounding against the linoleum. Outside, the night was alive with movement. Shadows darted between the buildings, too fast to be human. The air smelled of ozone and wet earth, the scent thick enough to choke on. Alexei's Geiger counter chattered like a mad thing, its needle buried in the red. Volkov emerged from the command post, his face pale in the floodlights. "What is going on?" No one answered. The radio in his hand crackled, the same voice slithering through. Too late. Then the floodlights died. Darkness swallowed the compound, broken only by the frantic beams of their flashlights. Alexei's pulse roared in his ears. He could feel them now. The children, the things that wore their shapes, closing in from all sides. Their laughter threaded through the night, high and bright and hungry. Volkov raised his pistol, his voice a razor's edge. "Rabos and Suler, Lepley, us and me." Fall back to the trucks. Now, they ran. Alexei's lungs burned, his legs numb with terror. Behind them, the barracks doors slammed shut one by one, the sound like a hammer falling. The trucks were just ahead, their engines already roaring to life as the guards scrambled to evacuate. A hand closed around Alexei's wrist. Cold. Brittle. He whirled, rifle raised. But there was nothing there, just the empty street and the church's steeple looming in the distance, its silhouette black against the starless sky. The voice whispered in his ear, so close he could feel the chill of its breath. "You'll come back. You'll come back." Then he was yanked into the truck, the doors slamming shut behind him. The convoy peeled away, tires screeching, leaving the dead zone and whatever lurked within it behind. No one spoke. No one dared. But as the lights of Pripyat faded into the night, Alexei pressed his forehead to the cold glass of the window and watched the reflection of small, pale faces flicker in the dark. Waiting, watching. Smiling. The evacuation truck rattled through the night, its headlights cutting through the fog like a blade through smoke. Inside, the soldiers sat in stunned silence, their faces hollow in the dim glow of the dashboard. Alexei clutched his rifle, his knuckles white, the echoes of laughter still ringing in his ears. Markov was the first to speak, his voice too loud in the cramped cabin. Radiation sickness. Hallucinations. That's all it was. He laughed, a brittle, jagged sound. "You ever read the reports from Hiroshima?" Sokolov didn't look up from his hands. Hiroshima didn't have children crawling out of the walls. "Shut up," Volkov snapped. His fingers drummed against the stock of his rifle, a nervous tick Alexei had never seen before. "We stick to the story. Looters. Rabid animals. Nothing else." His gaze flicked to Alexei, sharp as a knife, especially not the church. Alexei said nothing. The weight of the lie pressed against his ribs, suffocating. He could still smell the rot of the altar, still feel the cold grip of those small, skeletal fingers. The radio crackled to life, static hissing through the cab. A voice, distorted, barely recognizable, cut through the noise. "Team 2, do you copy?" Volkov grabbed the receiver. "This is team leader. Report." Silence. Then, clear as day, Lebedev's voice. "Why did you leave me?" The cab went dead quiet. Markov's breath hitched. Sokolov crossed himself. Volkov's hand trembled as he adjusted the frequency. Malfunction. Just interference. Alexei stared at the radio. The display screen was dark. No power. No signal. Yet the voice came again, softer now, almost playful. "You can't leave." "Not really." Then the static dissolved into laughter, high, bright, the sound of children playing a game only they understood. Volkov ripped the radio from its mount and hurled it out the window. The laughter followed them for miles, threading through the rumble of the engine, the whine of the tires. No one slept that night. Back at the temporary camp, the debriefing was a farce. The officers took notes with bored expressions, their pens scratching against paper like insects skittering across a floor. When Alexei mentioned the figures in the church, the lieutenant across the desk didn't even look up. Stress, fatigue, elevated radiation levels. The man's voice was flat, rehearsed. You're not the first to imagine things in the zone. Alexei's jaw tightened. I didn't imagine Lebedev disappearing. The lieutenant finally met his gaze, his eyes empty. Private Lebedev deserted. That's the official report. He slid a file across the desk, a single page stamped with the ministry's seal. Sign it. Alexei stared at the paper. The words blurred, but one line stood out in bold. No anomalous activity observed. His hand shook as he reached for the pen. That night, Alexei sat alone on the edge of his cot, cleaning his rifle by the dim glow of a lantern. The camp was quiet, the others lost in uneasy sleep or vodka-fueled oblivion. Outside, the wind carried whispers from the dead zone, too faint to decipher. A shadow moved at the edge of the tent. Alexei's finger hovered over the trigger. Who's there? No answer. Just the rustle of canvas, the creak of a floorboard. Then a whisper, so soft it might have been the wind. You know what you saw. Alexei's breath fogged in the sudden cold. His Geiger counter, silent since they left Pripyat, gave a single, shuddering click. When he looked up, the shadow was gone. But on the floor, just beyond the lantern's reach, a small handprint gleamed in the dust. Pale, perfect, waiting. The camp buzzed with nervous energy at dawn. Another squad had vanished overnight, 4 men, last seen patrolling the perimeter near the church. Their radios had cut out abruptly, their final transmission nothing but static and a single, distorted whisper, "They're singing to us." Alexei stood at attention in the command tent, his skin crawling beneath his uniform. The air smelled of stale coffee and sweat, the map on the table marked with red XS where patrols had disappeared. Volkov's voice was gravel. Search party leaves in 20. Petrov, you're on point. Alexei's stomach twisted. Sir, with respect. No respect, Volkov snapped. His eyes were bloodshot, his fingers tapping a frantic rhythm against his thigh. Orders come from higher up. They want that church searched again. Markov, leaning against the tent pole, scoffed. Higher up doesn't have to walk into that place. Volkov didn't reprimand him. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken fear. Outside, the wind carried the distant creak of the church's doors swinging open. The search party moved like ghosts through the abandoned streets, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. Alexei's Geiger counter clicked steadily, the needle hovering just below the red. The church loomed ahead, its steeple crooked against the gray sky, the black vines crawling up its walls thicker than before, pulsing, as if fed by something beneath the earth. Sokolov adjusted his gas mask. You think they're still alive? Alexei didn't answer. The air here was too still, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint hum of the reactor and the occasional giggle that slipped through the static of their radios. Then they found the first helmet. It lay in the middle of the road, its strap snapped, the glass of the gas mask shattered from the inside. Dark streaks, too thick to be mud, ran down its sides. Markov nudged it with his boot. What could have? A whisper. From the alley to their left, over here. Alexei spun, rifle raised. The alley was empty, save for a rusted bicycle and a pile of rags. But the rags moved, shifting as if something beneath them was breathing. Sokolov took a step back. We should call it in. The radio on Alexei's belt crackled. Volkov's voice strained. Team 3, report. Before Alexei could respond, the rags stood up. Not rags. A uniform. Private Kuznetsov, or what was left of him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Just a wet, rattling gasp. Then his jaw unhinged, stretching too wide, too far, and the laughter poured out. Not his voice. Theirs. Markov screamed and fired. The bullet tore through Kuznetsov's chest, but the man didn't fall. He grinned, his teeth blackened, his tongue lolling like a dead thing. The radio erupted in static, Volkov's voice swallowed by a chorus of children singing. The church will wake. The walls will shake. Kuznetsov's body collapsed, his limbs folding at impossible angles, his uniform deflating like a discarded skin. From the church's open doors, a dozen small figures peered out, their faces pale, their eyes reflecting the dim light like a cat's. Alexei's Geiger counter screamed. Run. Sokolov grabbed his arm, dragging him back as the figures stepped forward, their movements jerky, unnatural. They didn't chase. They watched. And as the search party fled, the laughter followed, weaving through the static, through the wind, through the very air itself. A promise. A warning. You'll be back. The command tent reeked of sweat and stale cigarette smoke. Maps of Pripyat were strewn across the table, marked with red circles around the church, each one a patrol that had vanished. Volkov leaned over them, his knuckles white against the wood. They're gone, he muttered. All of them. Alexei stood at attention, his pulse hammering in his throat. The weight of Lebedev's absence pressed against his ribs like a physical thing. A lieutenant with hollow eyes tossed a file onto the table. Another sweep. Tonight. Markov scoffed. Send more men to die. For what? The lieutenant's gaze flicked to him cold. For orders. Silence settled over the tent, thick and suffocating. The Geiger counter on the shelf clicked softly, its needle twitching in the red. Alexei clenched his fists. I'll lead it. Every head turned toward him. Volkov's eyes narrowed. You. Guilt gnawed at him, guilt for leaving Lebedev behind, for signing the lie, for pretending the church was just another ruin. But beneath it, something darker stirred. Curiosity. A need to know what lurked in those shadows. I've been inside before, Alexei said, forcing his voice steady. I know the layout. Volkov studied him for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. Fine. Take Sokolov and Markov. Full gear, flashlights, extra batteries, no detours. His voice dropped. And Petrov? Don't come back empty-handed. The church loomed ahead, its blackened steeple spearing the twilight sky. The vines crawling up its walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing. Alexei adjusted his gas mask, the rubber straps digging into his skin. Markov shifted beside him, his rifle trembling in his grip. This is suicide. Sokolov checked his Geiger counter, its clicks erratic. We're already dead. We just don't know it yet. Alexei ignored them, his focus locked on the church's gaping doors. The last light of day bled through the shattered stained glass, painting the steps in fractured hues of red and gold. A whisper slithered through the static of his radio. You came back. Alexei ripped the device from his belt and hurled it to the ground. The plastic cracked, but the voice continued, rising from the earth itself. We missed you. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and something sweetly rotten. The vines along the church's walls shivered, their surfaces glistening like wet ink. Markov backed away. Alexei grabbed his arm. We go in together. We leave together. Sokolov's laugh was hollow. That's not how this ends. The church doors groaned, swinging inward on unseen hinges. Darkness waited beyond. Alexei stepped forward, his boots crunching over broken glass. The air inside was thick, heavy, pressing against his lungs like a living thing. His flashlight beam cut through the dust, illuminating overturned pews, shattered icons, the altar. The altar. The symbols carved into its surface pulsed faintly, the black sap within them bubbling as if heated. A giggle echoed from the rafters. Markov's breath hitched. We're not alone. Shadows pooled at the edges of the light, shifting, coiling. Then the doors slammed shut behind them. The laughter began in earnest, high, bright, hungry, filling the nave until it drowned out the frantic stutter of the Geiger counters. Sokolov raised his rifle, his voice breaking. Show yourselves. The shadows obliged. Small figures peeled themselves from the walls, their skin translucent, their eyes black pits. They grinned, their mouths stretching too wide, their teeth needle thin. The one at the front tilted its head. You shouldn't have come back. Alexei's finger hovered over the trigger. The figure laughed. But we're so glad you did. Then the darkness surged forward, and the world dissolved into screams. The church was no longer a ruin. The moment the doors slammed shut, the air thickened, humming with an energy that made Alexei's teeth ache. The walls pulsed like living tissue, black vines writhing across the stone, their surfaces glistening with dark fluid. The overturned pews had righted themselves, arranged in perfect rows as if awaiting a congregation. Markov's flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the unnatural gloom. This isn't possible. Sokolov backed toward the doors, his rifle trembling. We need to go. The vines lashed out, wrapping around his ankles with a wet snap. He screamed as they dragged him down, his fingers clawing at the stone floor, leaving streaks of blood. Alexei fired. The bullet tore through the vines, but they didn't recoil. They multiplied, surging from the cracks in the floor like serpents from a nest. Sokolov's scream cut off abruptly as the darkness swallowed him whole. Markov grabbed Alexei's arm, his voice raw with terror. The altar. Look at the altar. The wooden surface had split open, the fissure widening like a grinning mouth. From within, pale hands emerged, small and skeletal, their fingers curling around the edges. A face pressed against the gap, smooth, featureless save for a yawning black void where its mouth should be. You're home, it whispered. The voice wasn't just in the air, it was inside Alexei's skull, slithering through his thoughts like a parasite. His Geiger counter erupted into a continuous scream, the needle buried so deep in the red it threatened to snap. Markov fired wildly, the muzzle flashes illuminating the horror in strobing bursts, shadows detaching from the walls, taking shape, children, dozens of them, their limbs too long, their movements jerky, the ceiling dripping black fluid. The droplets hanging in midair before streaking toward them like bullets. Sokolov's hand, just visible beneath the writhing mass of vines, his fingers twitching once before going still. Alexei grabbed Markov and ran. The doors were sealed, the wood groaning as something pressed against it from the outside. The laughter rose to a deafening crescendo, the children's voices overlapping, singing in a language that twisted Alexei's stomach. The steeple wakes, the dead will shake, the children feast on bones you break. Markov slammed his shoulder into the doors. They didn't budge. A cold hand closed around Alexei's wrist. He turned. The figure from the altar stood inches away, its hollow eyes boring into his. Up close, he could see the veins beneath its translucent skin, black, pulsing, spreading like cracks in ice. Its breath smelled of damp earth and spoiled milk. Stay, it murmured. Alexei wrenched free and fired point blank. The figure's head snapped back, but it didn't fall. It laughed, the sound wet and guttural, as the bullet hole in its forehead sealed itself shut. Markov screamed. Alexei turned just in time to see him lifted off his feet by an invisible force, his body contorting at impossible angles. His ribs cracked like dry twigs, his mouth stretching into a silent scream as his skin split along old scars, peeling back to reveal glistening muscle beneath. The children crowded closer, their tiny hands outstretched, their voices a chorus of delight. More. Alexei stumbled back, his boots slipping in the black fluid now coating the floor. His rifle clicked empty. The figure from the altar tilted its head. No more running. Then the vines surged forward, wrapping around his legs, his arms, his throat. The world went black. He woke to silence. The church stood as it had before, broken, desecrated, the vines retreating into the cracks in the floor as if they had never been. The altar was whole again, the symbols on its surface dull and lifeless. Markov and Sokolov were gone. Only their rifles remained, lying abandoned near the doorway, the barrels warped as if melted from within. Alexei's Geiger counter was silent. The radio on his belt crackled to life, Volkov's voice barely audible beneath the static. Petrov, status. Alexei opened his mouth. A whisper, from the rafters above, "Tell him you're alone." He looked up. The children perched in the shadows, their legs swinging, their grins identical. Waiting. Watching. Smiling. Alexei keyed the mic, his voice hollow. All clear. Returning to base. The laughter followed him all the way home. The camp was silent when Alexei returned. No guards at the perimeter, no voices from the tents, just the low hum of the generator and the distant, rhythmic clicking of a Geiger counter left behind. His boots crunched over broken glass as he staggered toward the command tent, his body numb, his mind still echoing with the children's laughter. Volkov stood over the radio, his back rigid, his fingers gripping the edge of the table like he was afraid the ground might tilt beneath him. He didn't turn when Alexei entered. Markov. Volkov's voice was flat. Gone. Alexei's tongue felt thick, the lie coating his throat like tar. Sokolov? Gone. Volkov exhaled sharply, his breath fogging in the suddenly cold air. The map in front of him was marked with fresh red XS, too many, clustered around the church like flies on a corpse. Then the radio hissed to life. Static, at first. Then a whisper, layered with voices, children, soldiers, something older. You left them behind. Volkov recoiled, knocking over a chair. The lantern light flickered, casting long shadows that slithered up the tent walls. Outside, the wind carried the scent of damp earth and something sweetly rotten. Alexei's Geiger counter, silent since the church, gave a single, shuddering click. Volkov's hand trembled as he reached for his pistol. We're pulling out. Full evacuation. Now. Now. A giggle from the corner of the tent. They turned. The shadows there were too deep, too dense, and within them, small figures stood motionless, their pale faces tilted upward. Their eyes were no longer hollow. They glowed. Like embers in the dark. Volkov raised his pistol. Identify yourselves. The figures didn't move. Didn't speak. Then, one by one, they smiled. The radio erupted in a chorus of shrieks. The voices of the missing patrols tangled with the children's laughter. The lantern winked out, plunging the tent into darkness. Alexei stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the tent flap. Cold fingers brushed his wrist. Stay. A voice whispered, so close he felt the chill of its breath. He tore free, bursting into the night. The camp was no longer empty. Between the tents, beneath the trucks, inside the barracks windows, pale figures stood watching, their eyes burning like coals in the dark. Volkov's voice, raw with terror, carried from the tent behind him. Petrov. Alexei didn't look back. He ran. The perimeter fence was just ahead, the world beyond it a blur of trees and distant safety. His lungs burned, his legs numb with exhaustion and fear. Behind him, the laughter rose, not chasing, not yet. Waiting. As he reached the fence, a whisper slithered through the wind, threading through the static of his shattered radio, through the pounding of his own heart. "You'll come back." Then, the glow of their eyes winked out. The camp fell silent. Alexei didn't stop running, but in the back of his mind, beneath the terror, a darker truth took root. They were right. The evacuation truck rattled down the abandoned highway, its headlights cutting through the fog like a blade through smoke. Alexei sat in the back, his fingers clenched around his rifle, the weight of the dead pressing against his ribs. The others, what remained of them, huddled in silence, their faces hollow in the dim glow of the dashboard. Markov's empty seat gaped beside him, the fabric still indented where he had last sat. Then the radio crackled to life. Static hissed through the cabin, sharp and sudden. Volkov, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands, didn't react. Alexei's Geiger counter, silent since they fled the church, gave a single, shuddering click. The static shifted, warped. Then a voice, distorted and layered, slithered through the noise. "Turn back." Sokolov flinched, his breath hitching. The voice continued, stretching thin, syllables slurring as if dragged through tar. "You cannot leave." "Not yet." Volkov's grip on the wheel tightened. Malfunction. Malfunction. Just a giggle cut him off. High-pitched, playful. Alexei's blood turned to ice. The radio screamed, a sound like metal tearing, like 100 voices shrieking at once. The truck swerved, tires screeching as Volkov fought the wheel. The static surged, swallowing the scream, and beneath it, a child's whisper. "The church misses you." Then, silence. The radio went dead. Sokolov exhaled sharply, his fingers digging into the seat. "Turn it off." Volkov didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the road, his jaw clenched. Alexei stared at the radio. The display screen was dark. No power. No signal. Yet the voice had been clear. A wet, choking sound came from the back of the truck. Alexei turned. "May." Private Vasiliev, the youngest of them, slumped forward, his hands pressed to his ears. Dark streaks of blood seeped between his fingers, dripping onto his uniform. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, just a wet, rattling gasp. Then he collapsed. The truck screeched to a halt. Volkov was out of the cab before the engine died, yanking open the back doors. Vasiliev lay motionless, his eyes wide and unseeing, blood pooling beneath his head. Sokolov scrambled back, his voice breaking. Alexei's Geiger counter erupted into a frenzied rattle, the needle buried deep in the red. The radio crackled again. No static this time, just a voice, soft, almost gentle. "You should have listened." Then the laughter began. Not from the radio. From outside. High-pitched, bright, bouncing off the trees like a living thing. Alexei's breath fogged in the sudden cold. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out everything but the laughter and the relentless click-click-click of the Geiger counter. Volkov's pistol was in his hand before Alexei could blink, his barrel sweeping the tree line. "Show yourselves." The laughter faded, leaving only the whisper of wind through dead branches. And then, a whisper, right beside Alexei's ear, "You'll come back." Volkov didn't hear it. His gaze stayed locked on the trees, his finger hovering over the trigger. But Alexei knew. They were already here, watching, waiting, smiling. The basement door groaned as Alexei forced it open, the sound like a dying man's last breath. The air that rushed up was thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, old blood, maybe, or the tang of irradiated metal. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow staircase descending into blackness. The steps were uneven, the concrete cracked and slick with moisture. Volkov's voice crackled over the radio, distorted by static. Report. Alexei keyed the mic, his voice low. Found a basement. Descending now. Static hissed back. Then, beneath the noise, a whisper, "Don't let them see you." He clenched his jaw and stepped forward. The stairs groaned underfoot, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. His Geiger counter clicked erratically, the needle twitching, as if unsure whether to spike or settle. Behind him, Sokolov's breath came in short, sharp bursts, his rifle sweeping the darkness. At the bottom, the beam of Alexei's flashlight caught on something pale and jagged: bones, small ones, scattered across the floor like broken twigs. A child's ribcage, the vertebrae strung together like macabre reeds. Sokolov gagged. Jesus Christ. Alexei's stomach twisted. The bones weren't old. They gleamed wetly in the light, the marrow still dark, as if the flesh had been stripped away recently. Then his light caught the far wall. Documents. Documents. Dozens of them, pinned to a corkboard or taped directly to the concrete. Soviet-era reports stamped with classified seals, black ink bleeding through yellowed paper. Some were handwritten, the Cyrillic script cramped and frantic. Others bore the crisp, impersonal type of official memos. Alexei stepped closer, his boot crunching over a small skull. The first document was a personnel list, names, dates, all redacted except one, Project Dushka. Sokolov exhaled sharply. What is this? Alexei didn't answer. His light moved to the next page, a medical report. Subject 12, male, age 7. Radiation tolerance exceeds projected thresholds. Neurological degradation observed. Vocalizations persist post-mortem. The words blurred. His pulse roared in his ears. A whisper slithered through the dark, too close, too soft. You found us. Alexei spun, his rifle snapping up. The basement was empty save for the bones, the papers, the shadows that clung too thickly to the corners. Sokolov hadn't reacted. He was still staring at the documents, his face pale. They were experimenting on them. Kids, before the meltdown. The radio on Alexei's belt crackled. Not static this time, laughter. High-pitched, gleeful. Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. Sokolov cursed, his flashlight flickering once before dying. The Geiger counter screamed, the needle slamming into the red. Something moved in the black. A wet, dragging sound, like flesh over concrete. Alexei's breath fogged in the sudden cold. His finger hovered over the trigger. Then, a hand, small and skeletal, closed around his ankle. The voice, when it came, was right beside his ear, its breath reeking of spoiled milk. Now you know. The basement door slammed shut above them. The laughter began in earnest. The basement air clung to Alexei's skin like a second uniform, damp and heavy with the scent of mildew and something sweetly rotten. His flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the darkness in erratic bursts as he scanned the documents pinned to the wall. The words blurred, then sharpened, each line more than the last. Subject 7, female, age 9. Exposure to 500 rads. No immediate physical deterioration. Subject reports voices post-exposure. Recommend termination. Alexei's hands shook. The paper crinkled under his grip. Sokolov exhaled sharply beside him. They were dosing them. Like lab rats. A whisper slithered through the dark, too close. We weren't rats. Alexei spun, rifle raised, but the basement was empty. Only the bones remained, scattered across the floor like discarded toys. His Geiger counter stuttered, the clicks merging into a frantic whine. Sokolov didn't react. He was fixated on another document, a faded photograph, children in thin hospital gowns, lined up against a concrete wall. Their faces were blurred, their postures slack, as if barely conscious. Behind them, a shadowed figure in a lab coat held a clipboard. The caption beneath read, Phase 3, Successful Neural Persistence Observed. Alexei's stomach twisted. They weren't just testing radiation tolerance. Sokolov's voice was hollow. Then what? The answer came from the darkness itself. A giggle, high-pitched, playful. Then another document fluttered to the floor, as if pushed by an unseen hand. Alexei snatched it up, his pulse roaring in his ears. Final report, Project Dushka. The text was dense, clinical, but one passage stood out, underlined in red. Subjects exhibit post-mortem activity. Neural patterns persist despite cellular decay. Recommend immediate containment at Site 12, Church of the Transfiguration. The church. Alexei's breath fogged in the sudden cold. The whispers weren't hallucinations. They were records. Sokolov backed toward the stairs, his boots crunching over bone. We need to go. Now. The radio on Alexei's belt crackled to life. Static. Then a voice, not Volkov's, a child's. You can't leave. The basement door above them groaned, then slammed shut with a force that shook dust from the ceiling. The flashlight flickered again, the beam catching movement in the far corner. Small figures, their skin translucent, their eyes black pits. They stepped forward, their movements jerky, unnatural. The first one tilted its head, its grin stretching too wide. You read our files, it whispered. Now you know what we are. Sokolov fired. The bullet tore through the figure's chest, but it didn't stagger. It laughed, the sound wet and guttural, as the wound sealed itself shut. The other children advanced, their voices overlapping, singing in a language that wasn't quite Russian. The church will wake, the walls will shake. The children feast on bones you break. Alexei's Geiger counter screamed. The flashlight died. In the dark, the whispers became hands, small and cold, closing around his wrists, his throat. Then the door burst open. Volkov stood silhouetted in the dim light, his pistol raised. Move. Alexei didn't hesitate. He bolted for the stairs, Sokolov at his heels, the children's laughter chasing them up the steps. The door slammed shut behind them, the wood splintering as something heavy threw itself against it. Volkov didn't lower his weapon. His eyes were wild, his voice a razor's edge. What did you see down there? Alexei opened his mouth. A whisper, from the basement below, slithered through the cracks in the floor. Tell him we're still here. The radio in Volkov's hand crackled, the voice clear as day. Tell him we're waiting. Volkov's face went pale. Alexei said nothing. But the truth was already written in the static, in the bones, in the laughter that followed them all the way back to the surface. The children weren't gone. They were awake, and they were hungry. The figures emerged from the walls. One moment, the church stood empty, broken pews, shattered icons, dust swirling in the fractured light. The next, the shadows moved, peeling away from the stone like wet paper, taking shape, small, pale. Their skin translucent, veins black beneath the surface like cracks in ice. Alexei's rifle trembled in his grip. Beside him, Volkov cursed, his pistol sweeping the nave. Identify yourselves. Volkov barked, his voice sharp with forced authority. The figures didn't answer. They tilted their heads in unison, their hollow eyes reflecting the dim light like a cat's. Then their mouths stretched, too wide, too many teeth, and the laughter began. High-pitched, playful, wrong. The sound slithered through Alexei's skull, scraping against his eardrums like nails on glass. His Geiger counter erupted into a frenzied rattle, the needle buried deep in the red. Sokolov backed toward the doors, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to go." The vine surged from the floor, black and glistening, wrapping around his ankles with a wet snap. He screamed as they yanked him off his feet, his fingers clawing at the stone, leaving streaks of blood. Alexei fired. The bullet tore through the nearest figure's chest, but the thing didn't stagger, it laughed, the sound wet and guttural, as the wound sealed itself shut. Volkov's pistol barked twice, the muzzle flashes illuminating the horror in strobes. Shadows detaching from the walls, taking shape, dozens of them, their limbs too long, their movements jerky. The ceiling dripping black fluid, the droplets hanging in midair before streaking toward them like bullets. Sokolov, dragged into the writhing mass of vines, his scream cut short as the darkness swallowed him whole. The radio on Volkov's belt shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, like 100 voices screaming at once. He ripped it free and hurled it to the ground, the plastic casing shattering. The laughter didn't stop. It grew, rising to a deafening crescendo, the children's voices overlapping, singing in a language that twisted Alexei's stomach. The steeple wakes, the dead will shake. The children feast on bones you break. The vines lashed out, wrapping around Volkov's legs. He roared, firing wildly, but the bullets passed through the figures like smoke. Alexei grabbed his arm, dragging him back. Move. They ran. The doors loomed ahead, the wood groaning as something pressed against it from the outside. The laughter followed, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling, the sound alive, hungry. A cold hand closed around Alexei's wrist. He turned. A figure stood inches away, its breath reeking of damp earth and spoiled milk. Its hollow eyes bored into his, its grin stretching ear to ear. "Stay," it whispered. Alexei wrenched free and fired point blank. The figure's head snapped back, but it didn't fall. It laughed as the bullet hole sealed itself shut. Volkov slammed his shoulder into the doors. They didn't budge. The vines surged forward, wrapping around their legs, their arms, their throats. The world dissolved into noise. Screams, laughter, and beneath it all, the relentless click, 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 click of the Geiger counters, counting down to 0. The last thing Alexei saw before the darkness took him was the altar, the symbols carved into its surface pulsing faintly, the black sap within them bubbling like a living thing. And the figures, watching, waiting, smiling. The vines tightened around Alexei's throat, their cold tendrils searing his skin like brands of ice. He thrashed, clawing at the black tendrils, his vision darkening at the edges. The church swam around him, pews splintering, walls weeping, the children's laughter rising to a fever pitch. Volkov was gone, swallowed by the writhing mass. Alexei's fingers brushed the hilt of his combat knife. With a roar, he slashed upward. The vines recoiled, hissing like steam on hot metal. The moment the pressure eased, Alexei twisted free, hitting the ground hard. His Geiger counter screamed, its needle buried deep in the red. The air burned his lungs with each breath, thick with the scent of ozone and spoiled milk. The figures watched from the shadows, their hollow eyes gleaming. "You can't leave," they whispered in unison. Alexei scrambled backward, his boots slipping in the black fluid coating the floor. His rifle lay abandoned near the altar, its barrel warped like melted wax. The knife would have to be enough. The doors loomed ahead, their wood groaning under the weight of something pressing from the other side. The vines surged after him, slithering across the stone like serpents. A whisper brushed his ear. "Stay with us." Alexei lunged for the doors, slamming his shoulder into the wood. It didn't budge. Behind him, the laughter swelled, the figures stepping forward, their small hands outstretched. Then, a crack. A sliver of light. The doors shuddered, the lock straining. Alexei threw his weight against them again, his muscles screaming. With a final heave, the wood gave way, and he spilled into the sunlight, the church's breath, cold and rotting, chasing him onto the steps. He didn't stop to look back. The perimeter fence was a blur in the distance, the world beyond it a haze of trees and safety. His legs burned, his lungs raw with every gasping breath. Behind him, the laughter faded, replaced by the creak of the church doors swinging shut. Silence. Alexei stumbled past the checkpoint, his knees buckling as he collapsed onto the cracked asphalt. The Geiger counter's frantic clicks slowed, the needle trembling back toward the yellow. Volkov's voice crackled over the abandoned radio nearby. "Petrov. Status." Alexei stared at the church, its steeple black against the twilight sky. The doors were closed, the vines still, but in the shattered stained glass, pale faces pressed against the panes, their hollow eyes watching. Waiting. Alexei keyed the mic, his voice hollow. "Gone. They're all gone." Static hissed back. Then, beneath the noise, a whisper only he could hear. "Not for long." The transmission cut off, and from the ruins behind him, the first scream echoed through the dead zone. Volkov's voice, raw with terror, swallowed by the chorus of children's laughter. Alexei turned and ran. But even as the camp's floodlights burned the shadows away, he knew the truth. They would follow. They always followed. The night swallowed Alexei whole as he stumbled away from the church, his boots kicking up clouds of irradiated dust. Behind him, the structure groaned, not from the wind, but from something deeper, something alive. The walls trembled, the blackened steeple swaying like a drunkard before the first bricks began to fall. He didn't look back. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and wet earth, his Geiger counter clicking erratically against his hip. His lungs burned with every breath, his throat raw from screaming. The perimeter fence was a distant glimmer, its barbed wire catching the moonlight like a promise. Then he felt them, watching. Alexei risked a glance over his shoulder. The ruins of the church stood silhouetted against the night, its collapsed walls still shuddering as if something beneath the rubble was trying to dig its way out. And there, perched atop the broken steeple, were the figures, small, pale, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They didn't move, didn't chase, they just smiled. A whisper slithered through the static of his ruined radio, the voice layered with children and something older. "You'll come back." Alexei ran. The fence loomed ahead, its metal links rattling in the unnatural wind. He vaulted over it, the barbs tearing through his uniform, drawing blood. He didn't feel it. The world beyond was a blur of skeletal trees and abandoned vehicles, the road to the evacuation point, barely visible beneath the overgrowth. The laughter followed, not from behind him, from inside his head. High-pitched, playful, hungry. His Geiger counter screamed, the needle buried in the red. The air tasted of copper and rot, his vision swimming with black spots. Still he ran. Ahead, the evacuation truck sat idling, its headlights cutting through the fog. The driver, some conscript Alexei didn't recognize, leaned out the window, his face pale. "Move," the man shouted. Alexei didn't need to be told twice. He threw himself into the back of the truck, his body collapsing against the cold metal floor. The engine roared, tires screeching as the vehicle peeled away, leaving. Pripyat, and whatever lurked within it behind. Silence. Then the radio crackled to life. Static. At first. Then a voice, Volkov's, strained and broken. "Petrov, you left us." Alexei's blood turned to ice. The driver didn't react. He couldn't hear it. The transmission dissolved into laughter. The voices of children and soldiers tangled together, rising in pitch until it bordered on screams. Then, clear as day, a whisper. "We'll see you soon." The radio went dead. Alexei pressed his forehead to the cold metal of the truck bed, his body shaking. The road stretched ahead, the trees thinning as they reached the edge of the exclusion zone. Safety. Sanity. But as the lights of Pripyat faded into the night, he knew the truth. They weren't gone. They were waiting, and no matter how far he ran, the whispers would always follow. The debriefing room smelled of stale tobacco and sweat. The officer across the desk, a colonel with a face like weathered stone, barely glanced up from the report as Alexei stood at attention, his hands clenched behind his back. The Geiger counter on the shelf clicked softly, its needle hovering just above normal. "Radiation accident," the colonel said, stamping the file with a heavy thud. "That's the official report." Alexei's jaw tightened. "Sir, with respect." The colonel cut him off with a raised hand. "No respect needed, private. The facts are clear, elevated exposure levels. Hallucinations, tragic, but not uncommon in the zone." His fingers tapped the desk, nails yellowed from years of cheap cigarettes. "Your squad mates were caught in a localized spike near the reactor. Unfortunate, but predictable. The lie settled between them like a corpse." Alexei forced his voice steady. "And the church?" The colonel's eyes flicked to him, cold and unreadable. "What church?" A whisper slithered through the static of the radio on the desk, "Liar," before dissolving into silence. The colonel didn't react. Alexei exhaled slowly. His hands trembled, but he kept them locked behind his back. "Understood, sir." The colonel slid the report across the desk. "Sign here." The words blurred as Alexei scanned the page. No anomalous activity observed. No structures of interest within patrol radius. The names of his squad mates were reduced to a single line: deceased due to acute radiation syndrome. His pen hovered over the dotted line. A giggle echoed in the back of his mind. High and bright. "Tell him we're still here," the voice whispered. Alexei signed. The colonel took the report, tucking it into a folder stamped with the ministry's seal. Dismissed. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of diesel and damp concrete. The base buzzed with activity, soldiers loading trucks, officers barking orders, but no one looked at Alexei. No one spoke of the missing patrols. Markov's empty bunk waited in the barracks, the sheets still rumpled from where he'd last slept. Sokolov's locker hung open, a half-empty bottle of vodka gathering dust on the shelf. Alexei sat on the edge of his cot, his fingers brushing the cracked casing of his Geiger counter. It was silent now, the needle resting at 0. The radio on the nightstand crackled to life. Static. At first. Then a whisper. Lebedev's voice, stretched thin. "You left us behind." Alexei's breath fogged in the sudden cold. The transmission cut off. But the laughter lingered, threading through the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant rumble of engines, the quiet click of the Geiger counter as it stirred to life once more. Counting, waiting, smiling. Sleep was a battlefield. Alexei lay on his cot, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The barracks were silent save for the occasional groan of the old pipes and the distant hum of the generator. His Geiger counter sat on the nightstand, its needle motionless in the dark. Then it clicked. A single, sharp sound, like a bone snapping. Alexei's breath hitched. The needle hadn't moved, the air was clean. Another click. Then another. Faster now, erratic, like a child tapping a spoon against glass. He sat up, his fingers curling around the counter. The plastic casing was cold, the display dark. No power. No signal. Yet the clicks continued, speeding into a frenzied rhythm. A whisper slithered through the dark, so close he could feel the chill of its breath. Can't sleep. Alexei's pulse roared in his ears. The barracks were empty. The other beds had been stripped bare after the evacuation, the sheets folded with military precision. But the whispers didn't care. They never did. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the sound away. Radiation sickness. Stress. That's what the doctors had said. That's what the reports claimed. But when he opened his eyes again, the shadows at the foot of his cot were moving. Not shifting. Not flickering. Breathing. Small, hunched figures coalesced from the dark, their outlines blurred like static on a television screen. Their heads tilted in unison, their hollow eyes reflecting the dim glow of the exit sign. No mouths. Yet the whispers came anyway. "You miss us," they murmured, their voices layered. Children, soldiers, something older. "You want to see us again." Alexei's fingers dug into the mattress. "You're not real." The figures giggled, the sound high and bright and wrong in the sterile silence of the barracks. Real enough. One of them reached out, its fingers brushing the edge of the cot. The fabric frosted where it touched, the fibers stiffening with ice. Alexei recoiled. His Geiger counter screamed, the needle slamming into the red. Then, silence. The figures were gone. The counter lay motionless on the nightstand, its display dark. Alexei exhaled, his breath fogging in the suddenly cold air. A whisper. From the corner of the room, "Sweet dreams." And as he lay back down, the laughter followed him into the dark. The reassignment papers arrived at dawn. Alexei stood at attention in the colonel's office, his hands clenched behind his back, the taste of metal thick on his tongue. The room smelled of stale coffee and damp paper, the air humming with the quiet click of a Geiger counter on the shelf. Siberia. The word glared up at him from the orders, stamped in bold red ink. A frozen wasteland, far from the dead zone, far from the whispers. A fresh start. The colonel didn't look up from his desk. Effective immediately. "Pack your gear." Alexei's throat tightened. "Sir, the colonel's pen paused. "You have something to say, private?" The radio on the desk hissed, static bleeding through the silence. Beneath the noise, a whisper, "You should have stayed." Alexei's blood turned to ice. The colonel didn't react. He slid the orders across the desk. "Sign here." Alexei's hand shook as he reached for the pen. The whispers had followed him for weeks. Laughter in the shower stalls, shadows flickering in his peripheral vision, the taste of spoiled milk in the back of his throat. The doctors called it radiation psychosis. The reports called it stress. But he knew. The children weren't done with him. He signed. The barracks were empty when he returned, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. His reflection stared back at him from the cracked mirror above the sink, pale, hollow-eyed, a ghost of the soldier who had first entered Pripyat. Then the glass misted over. Alexei froze. The temperature plummeted, his breath fogging in thick plumes. The Geiger counter in his duffel bag erupted into a frenzied rattle, the sound muffled by the fabric. The mirror's surface rippled like water. Figures moved beneath the glass, small, pale, their faces pressing against the other side as if trapped behind ice. Their hollow eyes locked onto his, their mouths stretching into grins too wide for their faces. The voice, when it came, was layered, children, soldiers, something older. "You thought you could leave." Alexei stumbled back, his boots slipping on the suddenly damp floor. The reflection in the mirror wasn't his anymore. It was them, dozens of them, their hands splayed against the glass, their fingers leaving streaks of black fluid as they clawed for purchase. The radio on the nightstand crackled to life, Volkov's voice distorted beyond recognition. "You left us, you left us." Then the glass shattered. Not outward. Inward. Shards hovered in midair, trembling, before streaking toward Alexei like bullets. He raised his arms, bracing for impact. Silence. The mirror was whole again. His reflection stared back at him, gaunt and terrified. But in the corner of the glass, just beyond the edge of his own silhouette, a small figure stood watching, its head tilted. Its mouth moved. "You'll come back." Then the barracks door creaked open behind him. The colonel stood in the threshold, his face unreadable. "Truck leaves in 10. Alexei turned. The room was empty. No figures, no whispers. Just the Geiger counter in his bag, clicking softly, counting, waiting. He shouldered his duffel and followed the colonel into the light. But as the truck rolled away from the base, Alexei pressed his forehead to the cold glass of the window and watched the reflection of small, pale faces flicker in the dark. Smiling, waving, following. The radio in Alexei's Siberian outpost crackled to life at midnight. He jolted awake, his fingers digging into the arms of his chair. The room was frigid, his breath fogging in the air, despite the iron stove glowing red in the corner. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the thin walls of the prefab structure. Static hissed from the speaker, sharp and insistent. Alexei's hand hovered over the dial. No one used this frequency. No one could. The nearest base was 200 kilometers of frozen wasteland away. Then the voice came. Garbled, broken, stretched thin by distance and distortion, but unmistakable. "Petrov, help us, Lebedev." Alexei's blood turned to ice. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the frequency, straining to hear through the noise. The church. It's waking up. The transmission dissolved into static, then surged back, louder now. Volkov's voice, raw with terror, overlapping with Markov's laughter in the high, bright shrieks of children. "They're singing to us, Petrov. Can you hear them? They're singing." A scream. Wet, guttural, the sound of flesh tearing. Then, clear as day, a whisper right beside the microphone, as if the speaker's lips were pressed against it. "You'll come back." The radio exploded in a chorus of shrieks, the voices of the dead tangled with the laughter of the children, rising in pitch until the speaker blew out in a shower of sparks. Silence. Alexei sat frozen, his pulse roaring in his ears. The Geiger counter on the shelf, silent for months, clicked once. Then again. Faster. The needle trembled, edging toward the yellow. Outside, the wind died abruptly. In the sudden quiet, Alexei heard it, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Singing. Children's voices, weaving through the pines, carried on air that smelled of damp earth and something sweetly rotten. The steeple wakes. The walls will shake. Alexei lunged for the window, his breath fogging the glass. The forest was empty, but the snow beneath his window bore footprints. Small, bare, leading away into the dark. The Geiger counter clicked faster. Alexei reached for his rifle. The singing grew louder. And from the ruins of Pripyat, 200 kilometers south, the church's doors groaned open. Years after the Soviet collapse, the old woman tells the story to her granddaughter by the fire. The flames cast long shadows on the peeling wallpaper of their cottage, just outside the exclusion zone. The air smells of damp wood and bitter tea. "You must never go to Pripyat," she whispers, her knotted fingers tightening around the child's wrist. "Not even when the soldiers are gone. Not even when the wolves return. The girl frowns. Why not? The fire pops. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters. The old woman leans closer. Because the children are still there. A log shifts in the hearth. The shadows stretch too long for a moment, fingers of darkness brushing the floorboards. The girl doesn't notice. What children? She asks. The old woman's voice drops to a whisper. The ones the Soviets left behind. The ones who played in the old church before the meltdown. She crosses herself. They say the soldiers took them there first, for tests. To see how much radiation a child could bear before, she stops, swallows. Before they stopped being children at all. The wind howls through the cracks in the door. Somewhere in the village, a dog begins to whine. The girl shivers. Are they dead? The old woman stares into the fire. No, not quite. You can hear them sometimes, when the wind blows from the west. Laughing. Singing that old rhyme, the church will wake, the walls will shake, her voice falters. And when the moon is thin, they say you can see them in the windows. Pale little things, waving, waiting for someone to come play. The tea has gone cold. The fire dims. The girl opens her mouth to ask another question. A giggle, high and bright, echoes from the woods outside. Not the wind. Not an animal. The old woman goes very still. The dog's whining turns to a howl. Then, abruptly, silence. The fire snuffs out. In the dark, the old woman clutches her granddaughter close. And from the radio in the corner, unplugged for years, a whisper slithers through the static. We see you. The night stretches on. In Pripyat, the church doors creak open, and the children, as always, are waiting.